Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to give people a few minutes to get signed in. Welcome to those of you that are just joining. We're just giving folks a couple minutes to sign in. It sometimes takes Zoom a little while to let everyone in the room. We'll start in 2 minutes. Sorry for the repetition, but for those who've just joined, we're just giving it a minute or two for people to sign in. We'll start at 5 after the hour. I see some of you are using the Q&A function already. That's great. If you have questions to put in there. You'll also notice there's an upvote function that's been enabled. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But if you have burning questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. We'll address them at the end, though. Okay, it looks like our numbers have stabilized and we have a few housekeeping things to cover at the start anyway. So we'll get started here. Um, Welcome to the webinar to provide an overview of the updates to the VCS program that were released on the 29th of August, 2023, last week. You can see the team who's up on the camera here. We'll introduce ourselves as we speak rather than taking a bunch of time at the start. So I'll just get started with a few housekeeping items. My name is Justin Wheeler. I'm the Senior Director of VCS Program Development. So objectives for this webinar is to just provide a general overview of the updates that have been released. The webinar is being recorded. I saw one question about that in the Q&A already, so that recording will be posted in the next day or two, depending how long it takes Zoom to release it to us. Questions, the Q&A function is live and all questions asked are visible to everyone attending the webinar, so please don't put confidential information in your question. There is also an upvoting function that has been enabled. So when we get to the Q&A at the end of the session, we will focus on the questions that have the most upvotes. We'll, of course, try to get to as many as possible. But if we if we're limited by time, we'll go by the upvote function. The team will also be answering some of the questions that are straightforward by typing the answers in. So you can click on answered, I believe, at least in my view, that's how it shows up, to see the questions that have already been asked and answered. Please focus your questions on the materials that we're presenting related to the program updates. We will not be answering questions related to other issues, so other Vera programs or things that weren't included in the program updates, and certainly not project-specific questions. As always, you can reach out to the info team with those types of questions. So the agenda, we have quite a few updates to get through. So it's necessarily going to be fairly high level and fast paced. So we're going to start with some of the usability and transparency related updates, and then we're going to dig into some of the program integrity related updates. Because there were quite a few updates and some of them were relatively minor, we're not going to speak to every single update. If you do have questions about an update that was just released that we don't cover, feel free to ask those in the chat and we'll try to answer them. And yeah, just a reminder, Q&A is public and upvoting function is available. So feel free to test that. Looks like we already have 12 upvotes on one question, so people are using that. Thank you very much for that. And just before we dive into these updates, this is the first of a few webinars. So we will be going into a bit more depth on specific topics or with specific audiences in some subsequent webinars. You can sign up for all of these on the website that has the program update announcement. They're listed at the bottom of that page. We have a QR code coming up that people can use. Unfortunately, we can't enable live links in the slide for you to click on. But there are the dates and times and topics of those upcoming webinars. So that'll be a chance also to follow up if we don't get to all the questions or get in as much depth as you want today. We'll also be reviewing all the questions we get, and if necessary, we may publish like a frequently asked questions document or something like that to just help answer some of the common questions. If you don't get your question answered, or if you have a question that's not really appropriate for the webinar for whatever reason, but does relate to the updates, you can always send us an email. Our team email inbox is programupdates@vera.org. And then if you have specific project related questions, follow the normal route. So the info@vera.org is your best window into the team that can answer those sorts of questions. So to start with, we just wanted to explain a little bit about where these updates came from. So we've had a number of consultations recently. Thank you very much to everyone who has participated in those. So there was a consultation on the AFOLU non-permanence risk tool last year. That was part of the updates that we just released, was the final release of the updated version of that. There was also a consultation last year on new Vera unit labels. So we drew heavily on those comments as we prepared the Article 6 and mitigation outcome type label guidance and functionality for this update. We also had a consultation last summer that included the update for upstream displacement. And that was not released in December because it required a little more work. So that update is also included in this round, and I'll speak to that at the end. And then finally, we had two public consultations. One that was a general open consultation. So we will be publishing those results soon. And we did look at any of the specific consultation comments that related to this update. And then we had a more targeted consultation on these proposed changes this summer. And of course, we reviewed all of those and we've published the results of those consultations. In terms of how we're going to manage today, so we're going to try and go in order and reference the ID numbers that are listed in the program updates overview and effective dates document. On the next slide, I have the full web address for that for anyone who doesn't have it open, and a QR code for that. So the ID numbers, that's what they mean. They don't mean order of precedence or importance or anything like that. It's just a way of helping you keep track of which update we're talking about and keep straight between the various program documents. And then finally, as always, the VCS rules and requirements page. So if you click in our website on VCS program and then go to program details, there's a drop down for rules and requirements that has all of the latest versions of the program documents that have just been updated. So this is a new thing. Hopefully it works for you. If anyone wants to try it out, you can just hold your phone up to the QR code and get the link. I don't know how to do it on your computer. Maybe there is a way for those of you who are smart enough to do that. Or of course you can type that full web address into your browser bar to get the document that has the effective dates. So I'll just pause on this slide for a minute so people can use that function if they want. And that's, again, just to help you follow along as we go through the updates, because we're going to move relatively quickly. Okay, just a quick word about effective dates. So the document that I just shared the link to is the summary of updates and effective dates. So there's 3 columns. There's the title, there's a little description of what the update is, and then there's a description of when the update is effective. Generally, there's 3 types of effective dates. So effective immediately means that from now on, we will be applying that update. That's generally used for things like definition updates or process updates that are to reflect the current practice. There are a number of dates that are set at March 1st, 2024, and they say all project requests. So that includes, when we say all project requests, that means requests submitted to Vera via the registry. So that would be like a pipeline listing request as under development or under validation, or a project registration request, or a verification approval request. So if it says all requests, it's intended to include all of those. Some of the effective dates, as we'll get into, have a little bit more nuance. So they say, for this type of request only, for the cutoff. So project proponents are always welcome to apply an update earlier than the effective date. That's at your discretion. If you do choose to do that, that's encouraged. That's wonderful. The only thing to be aware of is, please, if you apply an update, we will be expecting the VVB to be fully validating or verifying according to that updated requirement as well. So if you're a VVB, make sure that you're checking which version of the standard or relevant clause that a project is using. And if you're a project, make sure that your VVB is aware of which updates you've applied if you're applying them ahead of the grace periods. Okay, we'll now go into our first group of program updates related to usability and transparency, and we'll start with the revised project templates. So I'll hand it over to Anna. And the folks that aren't talking, you can go off video if you want to reduce the number of cameras on.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Mortimer. I am a senior program officer on the VCS program development team. So I'm going to introduce to you some of the revised updates to the VCS project templates. Overall, we made these updates so that the templates were more user-friendly. You'll notice that the actual style of reporting within these templates is slightly different, and that was for ease of use by all parties. So that includes the project proponents, VVBs, and then ultimately the Vera reviewer team. We also have additional guidance included in these templates, as well as additional revisions resulting from other program updates. So there's going to be new sections within these templates that didn't exist prior. The updated digital templates will be available on the Vera Project Hub within the coming months. And then these new templates are listed on the VCS program rules and requirements page. The new templates must be used after March 1, 2024, including all project requests. So whether you submit a listing under development request or verification approval request, those must all be on the new templates. As Justin mentioned, you're welcome to use the new templates as soon as possible. However, VVBs will also need to be using the new templates and then auditing all information that is provided in those new templates. We've also made several improvements to the registration issuance process. First, we've introduced a new procedure on project request denials. We've streamlined the overall review section of the registration issuance process, and there is a more formal structure for handling reviews that may not be accepted. This is effective immediately. We've also changed some language around buffer contribution as well as reversals and non-reversals. So we've changed catastrophic and non-catastrophic to avoidable and unavoidable. And then we've also clarified the procedures for the failure to submit a loss event report within 2 years of the discovery date. And then we've also clarified when a loss event report should be submitted if a loss is discovered during verification. Some other improvements to note is that we have clarified what documents must be submitted at baseline reassessment. We've also clarified procedures related to the baseline reassessment and inactive statuses. And then we have also clarified that a baseline reassessment is required to reactivate an already registered project. These effective dates are slightly different. So for section 426, it is effective for all project requests submitted on or after 1 March 2024 to reflect the effective dates of the templates. And then section 539 is effective immediately. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Ashley Swarar, who will be discussing labels.
I think I was going to take this one and then hand it to Ashley for the next one.
Sorry, everyone. Hand it to Justin.
No, that's totally fine. So the first of the three new labels that or label updates that was released along with this program update relates to mitigation outcome types. So this is labels for identifying credits that relate to emissions reductions, GHG emissions reductions, or credits that relate to CO2 removals. So there's a number of updates kind of throughout the program documents to enable this, including in the standard and in the templates. The effective date is March 1st for those updates, contingent upon the methodology also being updated if it's a type of project where the methodology needs to be updated. So there's three buckets of methodologies. Some are pure reductions or exclusively reductions, and others are exclusively removals. For those, the labels are available immediately and no methodology updates are required. And there's no need, obviously, to distinguish the subtotal of reductions and removals for those types of projects. The third bucket of projects is projects that have both reductions and removals from a single project activity. And those are the ones where we will be updating the methodologies to provide subtotals and allocation procedures for all of the project emissions and removals or sources and things. And then for those ones, as of March, you will be expected to report those subtotals according to the updated methodology. The registry functionality for subdividing groups of VCUs into different label types is also under development. We do have the ability to do that manually in the interim period, but we expect the functionality to be available kind of on the same timelines as the updated methodologies. So hopefully there won't be a big difference in timing between those two. There's a new document that's been released that has guidance for these labels. That's the mitigation outcome type label guidance. And there are also two key new definitions for emissions reductions and carbon dioxide removals that are in program definitions documents. So those are the key things to look at if you're keen to use these labels. For the projects that are of a single type, so either 100% reductions or 100% removals, labels are available retroactively as well. So Ashley, over to you.
Awesome, thank you. So everyone, my name is Ashley Sarar. I'm a senior program officer with the VCS program development team. I supported some of the updates related to Article 6 and CORSIA. So update 35 involves adding Article 6 labels on the VERA registry to identify VCUs that have been authorized by host countries for use under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. These labels are now available on the VERA registry. Project proponents may apply to receive up to 3 Article 6 labels, which indicate the host country's authorized uses under Article 6. These 3 labels include NDC use, which means it's authorized for use under an acquiring country's nationally determined contribution. 2, international mitigation purposes, which means it's authorized for use for international mitigation purpose other than a country's NDC. This includes aviation emissions mitigation obligations under CORSIA and upcoming marine shipping emissions mitigation frameworks. Lastly, the final label, other purposes, means the VCU is authorized for all other uses other than NDC and international mitigation purposes. This includes use in the voluntary carbon market. Note, Article 6 authorization can only be requested for VCUs that represent emissions reductions and removals from January 1st, 2021 onwards. All of this detail, including additional detail on Article 6 authorization process and the eligibility criteria required for a project proponent to apply and obtain an Article 6 label, is on the VERA registry. This is available in the new Article 6 guidance document. You can find this document on VERA's VCU labels website under market labels. Next slide, please. Thank you. So since Article 6 can be a bit of a complex landscape to navigate, VERA has also created a template for the letter of authorization. This is the primary piece of evidence needed to obtain an Article 6 label on the VERA registry. This template is now available for download on the VCS labels website as well. The template is intended to assist project proponents in approaching a host country when requesting Article 6 authorization. Using the template is optional, as the host country may provide a letter of authorization in any format of their choice, provided all required information is included. Project proponents may upload a letter of authorization to their VERA registry at any time after a project is listed. All information requirements for the letter of authorization, including explanations of such requirements, are also contained within the Article 6 guidance document I previously mentioned. Project proponents are encouraged to review the Article 6 guidance document in detail and use it in tandem with the letter of authorization template as applicable. I will now move into the update on CORSIA labels. So the International Civil Aviation Organization, in short, ICAO, sets criteria for CORSIA eligible emissions units. The VCS program has already been approved for the 2021-2023 pilot phase of CORSIA compliance. This means that VCUs that started their first crediting period on January 1st, 2016 onwards and represent emissions reductions or removals that occurred through the end of 2020 are fully approved for use under CORSIA for the 2021 to 2023 compliance period. Please see the VCS labels or the ICAO eligible emissions unit document for more information on approved methodologies and criteria for this past assessment of CORSIA program eligibility. To align with this compliance period distinction, effective immediately, all existing CORSIA labels have been updated to reflect the pilot phase or 2021-23 compliance period. ICAO recently reassessed which programs meet requirements for the next phase of CORSIA compliance. Through this assessment, the VCS program received conditional approval for the next phase of CORSIA compliance, which is also called the first phase and represents the 2024-2026 compliance period. The recent VCS updates fully aligned the VCS program with all eligibility criteria required for the first phase label. Last month, Vera also submitted a formal communication to ICAO to request full approval. Vera expects the VCS to be fully approved by March 2024 at the latest. CORSIA first phase labels will be available immediately after receiving this approval. Vera will also publish a CORSIA label guidance document similar to the Article 6 guidance document, which outlines all eligibility criteria for project proponents to apply and obtain a CORSIA first phase label. Additional updates are forthcoming, so please stay tuned. We will now move into integrity-related updates. Next slide. Perfect. So updates 20 and 21 involved adding clarity to VCS double counting requirements, such as no double issuance and no double claiming. This update built off existing text in the VCS standard. However, stakeholder feedback informed us that double counting requirements were hard to find and that they could be further clarified to align with CORSIA and ICVCM market developments. Vera took this opportunity to further clarify double counting requirements, definitions, and to ensure double counting evidence requirements were uniform for both double issuance and double claiming scenarios. Overall, this update clarified the following. Project proponents shall not seek credit for the same GHG emissions reduction or carbon dioxide removal or GHG-related credit under the VCS program and another GHG program, emissions trading program, binding emissions limit, or GHG-related environmental credit system. Further, where a project proponent has received or is seeking to receive credits for reductions or removals under the VCS program and aforementioned crediting system or program, evidence shall be provided that the same reductions or removals receiving credit under the VCS program have not been and will otherwise not be counted, used, or credited under the other system or program, or evidence must be provided to confirm the cancellation and non-use of those credits under the other system or program. Note, this update added clarity that project proponents must uniformly disclose if they are registered in multiple programs and or GHG-related crediting systems that overlap the VCS program. The updated evidence requirements also ensure project proponents are demonstrating conformance with no double issuance and no double claiming requirements. An example of required evidence includes a signed letter from the program administrator confirming the same reductions or removals under the VCS program have not and will not be used or credited under the other system, or a signed confirmation of the cancellation and non-use of the credits under the other system. For more information on the updated requirements, please see section 323 and 324 of the VCS standard. For more information on corresponding updates, please see section 4.2 of the registration issuance process and accompanying VCS template updates. The corresponding definition updates can also be found in the VCS program definitions document. Finally, update 23 involved the clarification of reporting requirements for projects that have supply chain implications. More specifically, a public statement is required where the project proponent or authorized representative is also the buyer or seller of a supply chain product which may be affected by the project. See section 324.7 of the standard for more detail on this update. All VCS standard program definitions are effective immediately. The updated evidence and reporting requirements for double counting and supply chain implications are effective for all project requests submitted on or after March 1st, 2024. This is to align with the effective dates for all of the VCS project templates. I will now pass it on to Anna to discuss safeguard-related updates.
Thanks, Ashley. So we've made quite a big change to the safeguard requirements in the VCS standard. I think it's first important to note that we have actually separated stakeholder engagement and VCS program safeguards into two separate sections. So I'm first going to touch on the stakeholder engagement requirements, and then I'll go into some more specific safeguard requirements. So first, across the board, all safeguards and stakeholder engagement requirements apply to all types of projects. Historically, the safeguards were separated into AFLU specific and then general, and now all safeguards and stakeholder engagement requirements apply to all project types. We have also removed the concept of local stakeholders, as there are stakeholders that are impacted by any project. So these requirements will require engagement with any type of stakeholder. This is specified in the stakeholder engagement section, and we clarify what we mean by stakeholder there. There are now some requirements about timing of ongoing communication and consultation related to stakeholder engagement. And we've also included specific requirements for what is shared during the free, prior, and informed consent process, as well as specified that this is an ongoing process and should be continued to be reported upon throughout the lifetime of the project. And we've also included procedures for comments received outside of a public comment period. The effective dates for these is 1 March 2024. So again, all safeguards now apply to the whole program. No net harm has been expanded, so many of what looks like to be new safeguards we would consider not new information, but rather specifications on what should be included as part of a no net harm demonstration. Now where property rights have been affected, project proponent must include a benefit sharing plan that is accessible and agreed upon by the local community. We've also structured the template so that any risk-based requirements shall include the assessment of the risk of negative impacts during the lifetime of the project or during the monitoring period, and the mitigation measures that are implemented to prevent these negative impacts. There are some requirements where there can be no risk, and the project proponent will have to demonstrate that the project meets the requirement. And then benefit sharing was not previously included. So as we've strengthened the requirements around property rights, such as specifying the groups which have property rights, a requirement on benefit sharing has been included. These new requirements are also effective as of 1 March 2024. So we've also updated requirements related to ecosystem safeguards. We have included what we now are calling ecosystem health. So we've updated requirements related to ecosystem conversion, and we've also strengthened invasive species requirements, which includes introducing reporting requirements for non-native species usage and the justification of such species. We've also introduced a requirement on the usage of non-native species in monoculture in ARR and WRC. We've also included a requirement on restoration of degraded ecosystems, where the project proponent shall demonstrate that the project activity restores a project area to a native ecosystem type represented in the same ecoregion as the project. The effective dates are slightly different for these requirements. So all requirements except for section 319.27, number 3, will be are effective as of 1 March 2024. Specifically, 319.27.3 does not apply to projects with the start date prior to 1 March 2024, pending further consultation. This is a change from the original release, and we will be consulting on this update further in the coming months. Now pass it on to Candace.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Anna. So hi, everyone. Candace Menke, I'm the Senior Director of Nature-Based Innovations, and I'm going to present 2 updates. So the first one's on project longevity and monitoring requirements. So in response to ICBCM's requirement that projects be monitored for a minimum 40 years, we updated our rules. Specifically, the minimum project longevity is now 40 years. So for projects with crediting periods longer than 40 years, this change is less impactful because monitoring and compensation is a requirement to continue crediting. But the update ensures that projects with a crediting period of less than 40 years still monitor and compensate for a minimum of 40 years. So this also includes situations where an instance leaves a group project before the project longevity is reached. And monitoring may be done by the project or Vera through the long-term monitoring system if Vera agrees to do so with the project in advance. But it's important to note that regardless of who monitors, projects are responsible for compensation if an avoidable reversal occurs. And then last, this update is effective for all project requests submitted on or after January 1st of next year. There's a typo in the slides and the documents, which will be updated after this call. And I know there was a question already about this in the chat, so I just wanted to clarify that. Next slide, please. So then next, a new version of the AFLU non-permanence risk tool has been released. This update's been a long time in the making and includes several changes. Specifically, the new tool now incorporates future climate change impacts and sea level rise. It has additional agriculture-specific risk factors and associated mitigation measures. The minimum withholding has increased, and negative scores are no longer allowed in any sections. And then we also added withholdings for jurisdictions with a history of government intervention and projects that have previously failed to submit a loss report on time. So that's within 2 years of detecting a loss. Also, adaptive management plans are now a requirement in response to ICBCM requirements, and remove the stakeholder engagement mitigation measure because it's now an expectation in the standard itself. And then as I previously mentioned, we extended the minimum project longevity to 40 years. The tool has been fully digitalized, and starting next year, projects will be required to use the new AFLU non-permanence risk assessment calculator. And it'll be available very shortly in the Vera Project Hub, and we'll automate the calculation of risk scores based on user input. So we're quite excited about that. And I think that's it from me. Is it back over to Justin now?
Yes, thanks, Candice. So the next program update relates to VVB oversight procedures. So we've updated the program guide to include some information on what Vera will do or can do to address performance issues with VVBs. So this is in section 6, I believe, of the program guide. There's also an update to the VCS program fee schedule. The only change there is to introduce a VVB reinstatement fee, which was necessary as part of the sanction procedure. So at the kind of high end of consequences that are listed there, Vera can suspend the eligibility of a VVB to participate in the VCS program. And then there's a process for VVBs to demonstrate that they've addressed the deficiencies that have been noted and reapply to be reinstated as a VVB. So this is part of the broader VVB performance management program that my colleague Janice is leading. She's just on vacation, so she can't speak today. There have been some dedicated information sessions for VVBs about this already. And we, as I mentioned at the top, we have a follow-up webinar specifically for VVBs, so we can get into more detail there. This is effective immediately in terms of the ability to do this being effective immediately. But it's not like this changes what you're doing at the project level. This just provides more transparency on our process to manage VVB performance. And then over to Liz to talk about discounting upstream emissions displacement.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks everybody for attending the webinar today. I am Liz Ginnessy. I'm Manager of Food and Blue Carbon Innovation at Vera, and I worked on the upstream displacement update. And so this is another integrity update. It's the addition of a new requirement for any methodology that credits upstream displacement activities, which refers to an activity that reduces greenhouse gas emissions upstream of where the activity is implemented. An example of this could be an activity that displaces a high carbon product like virgin plastic, for example, with a lower carbon alternative like recycled plastic. And so moving forward, methodologies must provide evidence of one-to-one displacement between, going back to my example, the consumption of the lower carbon alternative or the recycled plastic, and then the production of the high carbon product or the virgin plastic that is being displaced by the project activity. If methodologies are not able to provide that evidence, then they must provide an upstream displacement discount factor to account for this discrepancy. The discount factor must be supported by either peer-reviewed literature or a market analysis. And then a default discount factor of 30% must be applied where more specific evidence of displacement is not available. And in terms of rollout, the update is effective immediately for all new methodologies under development which have not yet initiated public consultation. Revisions to any existing methodology must incorporate these requirements prior to their approval by VERA. And then finally, VERA has issued some minor revisions to approved methodologies that credit upstream displacement. Projects that have already listed using the unrevised versions will have 6 months to complete validation, but otherwise all new projects must use the revised methodologies. And that's it on that update. Next slide, please. I think back to Justin.
Yeah, back to me to close us out. So last but not least, there were a number of updates to our methodology requirements to align with the changes to the project requirements and also to address some of the updated guidance from the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. So we have clarified the requirement for subject matter expertise of VVBs when assessing methodologies. So as most of you will know, that's kind of the final step of the methodology development and review process. So this update is there as well as in the program guide. The change there is just that we are more specific, that VVBs must include a group of experts for all areas applicable to the methodology. So for Liz's plastics example that she just gave, we would expect the VVBs to have an expert in plastics markets or to bring one on board for that engagement. We also added, and really kind of a clarification, but added a requirement to account for government policies and legal requirements when identifying baseline scenarios. So this is in the methodology requirements. This was, again, coming from ICVCM. There was a requirement specific to legislation. We just broadened it to clarify that it should account for all government policies and legal requirements. So that would be in a methodology update and then would flow through to projects that are identifying the baseline scenario using those updated methodologies. We added a requirement to determine GHG emissions reductions and carbon dioxide removals separately. So that relates back to the update on labels. So for those methodologies that have a mix of reductions and removals, we'll be updating those to specify how you separate between the two for the purpose of future labeling. We added requirements to ensure methodology compatibility with the transition to net zero. So this was a direct requirement coming from ICVCM. Again, this was being done in practice sort of informally, but we've just formalized and clarified what the requirements are there. We clarified the requirements for project methods that use historical data for baselines. So the default is 3 years, and we kind of specified when you would specify a period different than 3 years in the baseline historical data. And we clarified the requirements for methodologies using investment barrier analysis to assess additionality. This is probably the biggest in terms of text. It's relatively minor in terms of impact. Most of the methodologies actually align with this. It was just previously being managed in the review of the methodologies, and we pulled that up into the program requirements to make it obvious that we align with the ICVCM requirements there. So all of these updates to methodologies are effective immediately for new methodologies that are under development that have not yet reached the public consultation stage, and applicable to revisions to existing methodologies that are in the queue. We don't have any of those that are past public consultation, so it just applies to all of them. So I know that was a lot of information. That's the end of our list of updates. So we'll now move to the Q&A time, please feel free to add questions into the Q&A box. It should be on your menu at the top of your Zoom screen if you haven't found that yet. Please also scan through the questions that are there and upvote any that you would really like an answer to. We may not have time to quite get through all of them, although we do have a fair bit of time left. So we'll take them in priority order based on the upvoting. So the first one, I think this question was asked before Anna presented, so she did clarify the effective dates related to the new requirement for ARR and WRC activities with monoculture. But this is a common question and there's a few sub-questions there. So I'll invite Spencer, our forest carbon lead, to speak to that if you would.
Thanks, Justin. Hi, all. I'm Spencer Plum, the Senior Manager for Forest Carbon Innovation. And we have received a lot of comments about the monoculture restrictions that we put in place. So we are responding to that and going to reopen public comment on that so that we can get a broader perspective of the implications of that. So that will affect both how that is written potentially, and the effective dates will also be revised. So you'll see an announcement from us coming out in the next several weeks about the public comment period for that. And then in the coming months, we will have our changes proposed for the standard. So you'll be able to track that if you're following the Verra website. So appreciate all the input so far, and thanks for your patience.
And do you want to speak to some of those sub questions there, Spencer, or is that better left to the consultation?
I think it's probably better left to the consultation, just because there's we're going to look at all of it, and any sort of specifics that we get into could be subject to change. So I think it's better to kind of do that all in one fell swoop. And then while I've got the stage, I'll just also speak briefly to the ARR methodology. I see that as a question. I know it's not related to these updates, but we do anticipate that out in this month of September. So hopefully we get our final review done here soon. Thanks.
And just in terms of the timing on the update of the effective dates, so that has been published this morning. Maybe clear your cache on your web browser if you're not seeing the updated version. So if you're looking at the effective dates document at the top, it should say release date 29th August, last updated 12th September 2023. And that has the new effective date in there for this requirement and a couple other minor changes. And as Anna mentioned, the new effective date it's still March 1, but it's for projects with start dates later than March 1, as opposed to all project requests submitted after that date. So that gives some time for this consultation to complete and us to make any updates we need there. So the next question, sorry, I got bumped down to the bottom of the list. The next question also relates to that same requirement. So I think we'll defer that to the consultation. It was around the meaning of non-native. The one after that, again, I think this maybe came before before Candace spoke, but I'll maybe get her to come back in and answer it anyway, because it is a common question. If a project under validation has a crediting period of 30 years, does it mean the crediting period needs to be increased to 40 years to match the longevity period?
Yeah, this is a great question and a source of common confusion. So I think it's good to speak to this a little bit. So within the VCS program, there's a difference between the crediting period and the longevity period. So the short answer to this question is no, you do not have to increase your crediting period to a minimum of 40 years. But you need to increase your project longevity to 40 years. And increasing the crediting period is one way to do that, because when you're crediting for 40 years, then you're going to be monitoring and compensating for the 40 years. Alternatively, you can leave your crediting period at, for example, 20 years, but then you will have an additional 20-year liability at the end of that 20-year crediting period to monitor and compensate for avoidable reversals. So there is some flexibility, but there's a difference between the crediting period requirements and the project longevity period requirements.
Thanks, Candice. So the next one was anonymous. I should have mentioned this at the top, but for folks who are still submitting questions, of course, feel free to submit anonymously. We have enabled that option. It does limit our ability to follow up with you afterwards, though, if we don't get to your question. So if you have a question where you do want follow-up, if we don't get to it, then maybe don't check the anonymous option. So, oh, sorry, things are just moving a little bit. The upvoting is doing its job. So there's a question about what will happen to old issuances since they won't meet the new environmental and social safeguards program, as well as climate risk module. So that's an important clarification around how the effective dates work in general. So when we say effective for all requests as of March 1, that means that previously submitted requests or requests submitted between now and March 1, whether that's a verification or a validation request, will be assessed against the rules excluding that program update. So you won't be penalized for the lack of conformance with the updated requirement. You'd still be treated as you would have been if you had submitted in August of this year prior to these updates happening. The caveat there, and the thing that's still a little bit to be determined because we're not yet through the ICVCM assessment process for label eligibility, but some of these requirements relate to the ICVCM eligibility for core carbon principles or CCP labels, as they're going to be called. So if your project doesn't conform with a credit type requirement, you will not be eligible for that label for that historic period. So that's just one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at whether to update earlier or later. And those ICVCM criteria are available on their website. If you just Google ICVCM, it'll come up. So next question is, oh, sorry, I keep getting bumped to the end of our questions. So if a project has a status of pipeline listing under validation prior to 1st of March, is the project grandfathered into the VCS requirements? It does not seem feasible for a project to be held to newer standards after the validation has already commenced. So yeah, your listing won't change, but then when you proceed to the registration request, you'll be expected to, well, sorry, if you're under validation, then you're fine for that validation and registration. When you proceed to the next verification request, you will be expected to use the new templates. It's not retroactive going back to the things that were validated, but there is some reporting that happens every verification, so you'll be expected to conform with that reporting. Feel free to reach out to us if you are in that situation where you're kind of right on the verge and need more specific clarification. Okay, next up, and team, feel free to jump in and pick these out too if you see one that you really want to answer. So if a project, sorry, that one is done. What will happen to, these keep moving and I keep rereading the same one. Sorry, are projects listed and under validation before August 2023 using VCS standard 4.3 and 4.4 can use still the same versions? Yes, so that's a similar version of the same question. Mark that as done. Next one is back to the FOLU non-permanence risk tool. So the language has been changed regarding proportions of households consulted. It now asks about proportions of stakeholders consulted. Can we just explain this change a little bit and what's the impact for data that needs to be provided? That's a little bit specific, but Candace, it does have a few upvotes. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think in practice, we're not expecting much to change. The change in language was more so a clarification to reflect the diversity in projects. So the intention was not to change the unit from households to stakeholders in some project cases. It was just to use a broader term that's applicable for all project types.
Okay, thank you. And Candace, while I have you, there's also one about benefit sharing. Does benefit sharing have to include both monetary and non-monetary benefits? Is there any guidance you recommend with developing a benefit sharing plan? I wonder if you could speak to that.
I think Anna might be better positioned to speak.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, because that was part of the safeguards. Anna, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. We did not specify whether it needs to include monetary or non-monetary. At this point, it's the discretion of the community and the project proponent. But if further guidance on how we expect benefit sharing to occur to meet these requirements, or potentially how benefit sharing could be developed, if that is of interest to stakeholders, project proponents, VVBs, please reach out, and that's something that we could consider putting out in the future. I will say that the CCB program and the SD Vista program do provide some information on this as well, so those could both be good resources to look at when developing a benefit sharing mechanism.
And sorry, Anna, while I have you, maybe just to clarify for folks who aren't as familiar with that requirement, benefit sharing is not required for all projects. Those clauses are specific to a certain situation, correct?
Correct. Benefit sharing is only required for projects that impact property rights of Indigenous peoples, local communities, or customary rights holders.
Thank you. Okay, please keep upvoting. I'm relying on that to sort the questions. That one is done, sorry. Labels. In IFM, Improved Forest Management, there are some methodologies that can be both removals or avoidance. Is there going to be a clarification for each activity within the current methodologies in order to get access to the label? Or those IFM methodologies are not eligible for a label according to the column, current methodology compatible with the label? I'll hand it over to Spencer in a minute, but this just generally on the reductions and removals labels, as I said, if a methodology has both activities can be quantified with, or both mitigation outcome types can be quantified within a methodology, then the labels will not be available until that meth has been updated to provide equations and procedures for distinguishing between the two. So if you look on our website, we've added, as referenced in the question, if you look on the methodologies website, we've added a line under each methodology that says, is it a reduction, is it a removal, or is it both, and is it currently compatible with the label? So the ones that say no, it's typically, I think in all cases, it's because it's both and the meth has not been updated yet. But Spencer, do you want to add anything related to IFM specifically there?
I think we're starting the process of looking at all the IFM methodologies, because you're correct that there are some methodologies that could have both removals and reductions. And so as we go through and review those methodologies and propose revisions, we will be updating the equations so that we can separate out removals from reductions. So until we do that, though, they will not be able to be accounted for as a removal or a reduction separately. So we're working on that currently.
Thanks, Spencer. So the next one, Anna, this is back to you. It has a question about the requirement: the project proponent shall conduct a stakeholder consultation before implementation of project activities. So this is referring to the local stakeholder consultation. Does it apply retroactively to projects? So this is a clarification. So in most cases, this should have happened anyway under the previous requirements. But it's not retroactive. So if it wasn't required for your project for some reason, or you don't have all the evidence collected because you didn't know it was a requirement at the time, and you're already issuing credits, then this is not retroactive. But Anna, do you want to jump in and say anything else on that one?
No, that's right. That if you've already been registered, this isn't the case, but their question was about listing. So their question is if they had listed as under development and did not conduct stakeholder consultation prior to the implementation of project activities, instead conducted stakeholder consultation during the implementation phase, they're asking if they won't be eligible if they request to list as under validation after March 1, 2024. Maybe Justin, do you want to take a stab at that, or do you want me to go
Sure.
for it?
Yeah, I can speak to it if you want. So, I mean, I guess it depends on what shows up in the consultation, essentially. So if you planted while doing your consultation or something and didn't have it fully complete or documented because you didn't know this was a requirement, you can still provide the information as you always would on the consultation. And the reason for this is related to free, prior, and informed consent, right? So if there's no communities that are or stakeholders that are significantly impacted by the project, or the people that are impacted are in full agreement and support as demonstrated through your consultation, then we're not going to fail you just because of the timing of that consultation. But if you failed to consult upfront and you have significant stakeholder issues so that you're not passing the previous requirement, which was do no harm, then it's not about this applying retroactively. It's that you didn't meet the previous requirement. So that's why I said this is kind of a clarification as opposed to a new requirement. We've gotten more specific, but the previous requirement was quite expansive in terms of it shall do no harm on local communities and stakeholders and the environment. So that would be the test that would be applied for that type of project. The next question is, can we give an example on how to incorporate government policies and legislation to a baseline scenario? For example, laws on zero deforestation. Spencer, I might turn to you on zero deforestation, but maybe I'll speak to it more generally. I come from the energy and industrial world, so my example would be in that space where if you're in a jurisdiction that maybe has a carbon tax that's applying to transportation emissions and you have a transportation related project, the project is not necessarily required by law, but there is an incentive there to reduce those emissions. So you would be expected to account for that in your baseline scenario. So if the tax was on a schedule that was ramping up over time and the government had published some impact assessments, or a credible third party had published some impact assessments, and that's overlapping with the type of activity that's being driven by your project, you would be expected to account for that in your baseline, which would essentially deduct the total quantity of credits. So this is for the case where you pass the regulatory surplus for the purpose of additionality. So you're eligible to participate in the program, but there's some shared attribution of the reductions or removals that are being seen by the project. And we want to make sure that people are properly calibrating their baseline so that they're not taking credit for government policies. But Spencer, I don't know if you want to speak to the deforestation one, or if we just want to leave it general for now.
It's a little bit outside of my expertise, and I don't see anybody from the red team on our on the webinar. But I would just say I think you covered it, Justin. Uh, the only thing I can add is that I know that for unplanned deforestation, often that happens in countries where there are laws about zero deforestation, but in reality, that is not being upheld by the law. So I think there are um, those types of projects would still be eligible.
Great. Thanks, Spencer. And the other thing maybe to mention, just building on what Spencer said, is you can take into account the level of enforcement. So if there's a law that's kind of on the book, but has never actually been applied or enforced, you can kind of provide that information to your VVB, similar to how in the regulatory surplus you can account for that if you're outside of Annex 1 countries. Okay, the next question. Oh, I think we sort of answered that one live already. Sorry, that was again on stakeholder engagement. The next question is, sorry, there's just a little bit of repetition. I don't want to bore you with giving the same answer. So about the VVB program, again, retroactivity, will you be retroactively going back and looking at old projects for quality under your new VVB integrity program? I ask this because I'm seeing some projects where VVBs did not do a good job. So this one is a little bit different. Like if we're assessing a VVB performance, yes, we would be assessing kind of the body of their work. We're not going to go back like 5 or 10 years or something like that. But if there's an issue that's come up that demonstrates that a VVB kind of failed to do what it was supposed to do, even if that verification or validation happened a year or two ago, yeah, the team would likely be following up with the VVB. We're not going to jump straight to sanctions or suspensions. Obviously, the team will calibrate it depending on the nature of the issue and how pervasive across the body of work of that VVB is and that sort of thing. But we will be considering all recent activities from a VVB when we're looking at that. Feel free to come to the VVB webinar. Janice, who's the lead on this, will be in that webinar and can answer more questions at that time. There's another one, I think, which is relatively old, but we'll answer it anyway. It's not clear what we mean by submitted, listed, for validation. So when we say request submitted, that's for the cutoff date. So as we said previously, that means all requests, whether that's a listing request or a registration request or a verification request. And then the date for the cutoff is when was that request submitted to Vera. We don't want to have a differential impact depending where people are in the review process. We want to go by a clear date that everyone knows and we have a clear record of. So that's why we choose that date. Oh, Spencer, we have an LTA question for you. For ARR projects, the long-term average needs to include complete cycles after the crediting period, i.e. 30 years, or the longevity is also affecting, I think that should say, or is the longevity also affecting the calculation of the LTA? And maybe this is partly Candace too, but Spencer, can you speak to that? Or
It's a good question. So I think we do need to have the LTA include the last harvest cycle. But in that case, I think you could include the last harvest cycle, and then you would still have a liability to have a 40-year 40-year requirement for that project. So I'm not exactly sure, Candace, if you have any better way to answer that. I'm not sure that I got to it.
No, I think you more or less answered it the best we can right now, but it's a good question, and we'll think a bit more about that after this call, I think.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this is good. We're at 10 after the hour. We do have a little bit more time scheduled. We're getting down into questions that have kind of 3 or 4 or 5 upvotes. So please feel free to ask questions or upvote if you want to bump them up in the queue. We have 84 open questions, so we're probably not going to get through all of them. There is some repetition, but please use the upvote function if there's a question you're really hoping gets answered. This one I think we sort of covered, but it's maybe worth reiterating. Projects shall have a minimum of a 40-year project longevity, which is effective for all project requests submitted, well, not just moved, submitted after Jan 1. Oh, sorry, I lost the question. I encouraged everyone to upvote, and now it's moved.
Yeah, is this applicable for projects which are under validation? I think you already addressed it, Justin, when you answered your question that it depends on the date the request is sent. So it would be applicable to validation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think we answered that one already too. Just going to mark it as answered. Given the immediate effective date, what happens to old projects under next verification which did not meet environmental and social safeguards and climate risk requirements at validation? This is particularly pertinent for FPIC. Yeah, so I kind of spoke to this, but I think it's worth reiterating. So when you look at the updated templates in particular, you'll see that there's information to report on the safeguards, but it doesn't go back to the original consultation. So there are some of the requirements that only apply to validation, so they would only then apply for validation requests. And then there are some requirements that are expected to be in an ongoing way, and those are the requirements that we would expect to see in the verification. So it's not retroactive per se, but the applicable clauses are effective for those requests. That being said, we had previous requirements on FPIC and consultation, as I mentioned. So if a project did not conform with those previous requirements, and we discover that at a later date, that would be an issue that we would want to follow up on in most cases. Okay, we answered that one. I think we've answered that one too. Sorry, I'm just getting through the ones that we've already answered. So if a project has status of pipeline listing under validation prior to 1st of March, is the project grandfathered into VCS requirements prior to the August 2023 update? Yeah, I think that's a little bit of a reiteration. Depends on the specific requirement, but yes, in most cases, if you have that status before, then we're not going to retroactively go back and make you redo validation for that same update. And that's why we use the request. So, do make sure you're listing as under validation when you're actually under validation. Don't go and request a listing as under validation if you're not ready for the validation, though. Like, we do expect people to be genuinely under validation. So, typically that would be like you have a contract, you have a kickoff meeting, all your documents are complete and submitted to the validator. So it's not a get out of jail free card. It's to appropriately reflect the status of the projects. Regarding the reassessment of the baseline, 3.2.6, could you provide information about the sections to be updated when the project is using the VCS plus CCB template? That's fairly specific, and I don't know if you want to speak to that or if you want to leave that to offline. It's anonymous, so if that was your question, maybe send us an email because we won't be able to rattle off all the sections here. But you want to speak to it generally, Anna?
Yeah, I can speak to it because I think this question came up in slightly different forms several times. So the templates obviously are not a one-to-one, but in general, the sections are very similar. It's, the baseline section, additionality. So I think if you're looking for a one-to-one, the title of the section in the VCS template would be the same, general title as it is in the CCB template. We know that people are very anxious to have joint VCS CCB updated templates. That is in the works. Unfortunately, since we're the VCS team and not the sustainable development team, we don't have an exact answer for that in terms of timing, but that is something that is being worked on in addition to some other sustainable development related updates.
Yeah, so stay tuned for updated templates there. And once those are updated, if we need to put out an FAQ or something that provides that mapping, we can do that. Okay, Candace, here's your question. Is it the responsibility of the project or Vera to conduct monitoring after the end of the crediting period, but before the 40 years are up if it's in that situation? If the project has to report, are there tools that can be used to keep the cost down, especially for ARR? Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. So in situations where the crediting period is shorter than 40 years, which is our minimum project longevity, the monitoring may be done by the project or Vera. So Vera, as I believe most stakeholders know, is in the process of building our long-term monitoring system. And as our capacity to monitor improves and additional project types come on, we increasingly will take on that responsibility for monitoring for that gap period. But at the moment, it's on a case-by-case basis on agreement with us on who will do the monitoring. So we will be exploring that with projects. It's likely that we may be able to do it for forest carbon projects in the nearer term, but for other project types, it may be further out before we're able to take on that responsibility.
Thanks. Yeah, so please follow up if you're a project that's in that situation, get in touch with us directly to understand if that's an option that's available and to enter into the appropriate agreements.
Yeah, and one thing maybe to add, Justin, likely what we will be doing is releasing a list of project types that we're willing to take on monitoring of for that gap period in the near future, so that you don't need to come to us on a case-by-case basis. It would be on like sort of a group level or project type basis that we would make that commitment.
Okay, thank you. The next one is, how does Vera anticipate handling any Section 6 reviews of VVBs? Are there additional staff dedicated to this task? What's the timeline for Section 6 reviews on the side of Vera? We imagine it may be a large and time-consuming undertaking. So maybe to start with, Section 6 is a kind of a shorthand. Sometimes we refer to Section 6 reviews as the reference to the procedure in the registration and issuance process for reviewing projects that have potentially material issues that might require reconciliation. And then coincidentally, it's also Section 6 of the program guide where we lay out some of the sanctions and procedures for reviews. So I'll try to speak to both of those quickly. We do have some additional staff that are dedicated to the VVB performance management in general, including improved guidance and support for VVBs. And they will be, that same team will be the ones looking at the other parts of the performance management system. Please come to that webinar. We'll speak to that in more detail. In terms of timeline, it's really case specific, depending on the type of situation and how much material needs to be reviewed and our external experts needed. This is more on the project section 6 reviews. So we don't specify a timeline because it is so case specific. And for the VVBs, this is a newer procedure, so we also haven't specified a timeline yet. Feel free to ask that in that next webinar. Okay, one has been upvoted. You often say contact us. However, we find that Vera often does not respond to email inquiries in a timely manner. Is there plans for more effective communication portal or mechanism to handle guidance requests? Fair question. I'm sorry you feel like that's the experience. I think there's an important couple things to point out there. For the program updates, please contact the program updates inbox. Our team manages that, and we will answer the questions that relate to program updates as quickly as we're able. We don't have a big backlog on that side. Obviously, the info box has a much broader type or broader set of questions they can receive. There is a dedicated team there, and they are doing a number of things to expedite that process. So if it's program updates, please email programupdates@vera.org. If it's other questions like projects and things like that, please email the info box. We have just recently opened a project portal for project-specific information, and we are increasingly putting out some frequently asked questions and other resources like that. So it may be that we just point you to one of the existing resources. But yeah, we are doing a number of things to be responsive to stakeholder inquiries. So fair question, and we're working on it. Hopefully your experience improves, anonymous attendee. Okay, we're getting close to the end. So maybe I'll just pick out one or two more. There was a question related to, are we submitting into the ICVCM process? So we have put out a statement related to ICVCM. Feel free to refer to that. We're actively engaged with them. The next step is the credit type working group. So that's the working group that will be determining what the boundaries are for different credit types for the later assessment procedure. And there's kind of a high risk, low risk, medium risk grouping that will come out of that. So we don't know exactly what those boundaries are yet and which methodologies will apply. So we don't want to kind of fully commit until we have all of the details. We do anticipate that we will be submitting to the ICVCM as those details become clear. And so yes, we do have to specify methodologies once we get to that stage. We haven't made any determinations yet on exactly methodology versions or things like that, because we need to see how that process will look from the ICVCM side. The general timelines for ICVCM are available on their website in terms of their assessment timelines. As was mentioned, we are CORSIA compliant, so they have kind of a fast track for CORSIA compliant programs. Maybe one more, and then I think we should close because we're at the bottom of the hour. All right, team, feel free to flag any last ones. I'm just browsing for ones we haven't covered. maybe this one, Anna, I wonder if you could speak to this. When reassessing a baseline, this shouldn't be viewed as a revalidation, correct? The project would not need to comply with the new safeguard requirement or other new VCS requirements that are for validation only if it's a baseline reassessment. Can you speak to that?
Yep. So that's correct. At baseline reassessment, we're not expecting a revalidation, so we wouldn't. So a project is not required to then meet any requirements that occurred at validation. This is true for crediting period renewal requests as well. However, any updates to the VCS program that would impact verifications of a project moving forward must be adhered to. So there are safeguard and stakeholder engagement requirements within the new updates that a project would have to report on at their next verification, even if it includes a baseline reassessment.
Great, thank you. And there's one more, Anna, that while I have you, I'll get you to speak to, and it relates to adding instances to projects that have already been registered under the old rules. How long will it be possible to incorporate new instances under these old quote unquote standards?
Yeah, that's a great question that has a similar answer to what I previously answered. So let me recap it so it is more reflexive of this question. So any new instance added as a group project is required to meet those validation requirements that were in place when the original project was validated. So as long as those instances continue to meet the validation related requirements, those instances can continue to be added. However, as I mentioned before, any requirements that impact verifications or monitoring moving forward after the original project was validated must be adhered to. So if there's a new requirement related to verification that the entire project must adhere to, when a new instance is added, it must also adhere to those requirements.
Great, thank you. So I think we'll leave it there. Thank you everyone for your participation and for your questions and upvoting the questions that helped us prioritize. Hopefully you all found this useful. Let me just click back to the webinar slide. So these are the next webinars. They all happen the week of September 25th. So there's one that will be a slightly deeper dive for project developers. So similar content, but a little bit more targeted. There will also be one that focuses in on the VCU labels. So we'll do a little bit more detailed walkthrough of the label procedure. That's both the Article 6 and mitigation outcome type labels. And finally, we will also do a deeper dive specific to VVBs, where it'll be similar content, but then we'll add some commentary on what's expected for VVBs of each of these requirements. So thank you again for your attendance and participation. Feel free to get in touch with us at program updates at vera.org. Sorry, I should put that up. And the general inbox is also there. So thank you, everyone.